Hello and welcome to Under the Mountain with Grady Hendrix. My name is Anthony, and this is one of our special little videos we like to do with guest authors that we've had here at the library. Uh, Let me introduce Grady Hendrix to you. Grady is the author of Paperbacks from Hell, which won the Bram Stoker Award in 2018. He is the author of My Best Friend's Exorcism, which was recently made into a movie on Hulu. He also wrote Horror Store. He also wrote Final Girl Support Group, the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which I'm glad I was able to say that title without slipping up, and also most recently, How to Sell a Haunted House, which we'll be talking about a little bit later on in this video. So we're going to later say, if you don't want to hear spoilers, you might want to go read the book, then come back and watch it then. So we will give you fair warning, so don't worry. I just want to start things off right off the bat with talking about in relation to your stuff. Well, full disclosure to people watching, I have talked to Grady Hendrix before in interviews, so we have some familiarity with talking. So working off of that, we have discussed in the past humor in his work, and I wanted to address that again because in thinking about it, it's a fine line people have with horror and humor, whereas sometimes comedies that have horror in them don't always work. But then horror with humor, on the other hand, I think can be really powerful. And I believe you, Grady Hendrix, are in that category where books are definitely horror novels, but they're full of humor. And I guess I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how you walk that line.
Yeah, well, to me, there really is no difference. I can't think of a single horror movie and to a large extent book that doesn't have a fair amount of humor in it. I mean, The Thing has one of the greatest audience slaying laugh lines of all times in it. I've never been with an audience that hasn't died there. Reading Rosemary's Baby, it's a really, really funny book. And I remember I reread it recently and I was like, whoa, is this a horror novel? And then it takes its turns, but you really do feel like it's more of a comedy than anything. To me, it's not so much about like trying to dial one up and one down and keep the levels right. It's writing about real life, and in real life, we don't really live in a genre, right? Like all our lives are sort of musical tragic comedies with hopefully some romance, maybe paranormal romance. And the best stuff in our life happens next to the worst stuff. You get the call that your father has died right after someone told you the funniest joke you've ever heard. You have the best sex of your life 1 hour before your dog gets hit by a car. Like we don't, all this stuff sits next to each other in our lives. And so for me, I just try to make the books really feel real. And often when you apply the reality principle to horror concepts, they get a little goofy. What would an exorcism look like if it was real and you had someone doing it and it was the 80s? It looks a little goofy. It's one of the things, it's funny is a lot of my stuff gets adapted to film and television. It's one of the places I have a really hard time with because everyone wants to talk about tone. All these producers, tone. And what I keep saying is just take it seriously. Like the comedy and the horror are baked into the concept. It's a support group for final girls. That's funny. But also, think about it this way, it's a support group for women who've experienced insanely horrible, traumatizing events in their past and are trying to live a life in the shadow of those events. And they've had their lives turned into these media circuses. Their pain has become popcorn movies. So that's horrifying. So just take it really seriously, and the horror and the comedy and the tone will take care of itself.
No, I think that is really interesting because, speaking about humor and horror, because I feel like we do have this idea of the best horror being these very serious works. And I rewatched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the first time not too long ago, and I was surprised by how much humor was in it. I mean,
There's some clowny stuff in there.
well, just the whole, the time to hammer the poor girl's head is the old, get putting this hammer in the old man's hand, and it's just going on forever, and it's just this is pure insanity, and it's disturbing, but it's hilarious at the same time.
Yeah, that is
Uh,
one of the darkest jokes ever in a horror movie.
it's I believe Toby Hooper, how he described it was he called his humor red humor, as opposed to black humor.
Yeah.
uh, and so I wanted to, since this we are talking about your most recent novel, How to Sell a Haunted House, I wanted to talk to you today about haunted houses and, ghost stories too, just because you can't have a haunted house without a ghost story, or can you? So just right off the bat, in your opinion, what makes a good haunted house story?
I mean, listen, I like to be surprised. So a haunted house story that shows me something I haven't seen before, I'm in. Um, you can have everything from a snowbound cabin in Maynard's house to a modern, contemporary glass and steel suburban home like in Anne River Siddons, The House Next Door, or you can have a Victorian mansion haunted by sand ghosts, like in Michael McDowell's The Elementals. I don't care. But the one thing I think haunted house stories are about, and definitely the reason I wrote mine, is they're all about families. They're always, almost always about families, family curses, family secrets, family, relationships. I mean, The Shining, it doesn't even take place in a house, it's a hotel, but it's about a family. The Haunting of Hill House is about, Eleanor's missing mother, her family, the family she doesn't have, and that she doesn't belong to. You look at Beloved by Toni Morrison, it's about her baby on a certain level, the family that was taken from her. So are always about families. And I wrote this during the pandemic. And, one of the reasons I did was when you write a book, you spend a long period of time with that book. And I wanted to spend time with the family. I couldn't be with my own. So I got to make one up.
Mentioning some of those other titles like you did was that something that did you find yourself while writing this book being like, okay, am I borrowing too closely to other works? Am I falling too obviously into tropes? Is
No,
or do you
that's nothing I'm worried about too much. I'm pretty good at separating my influences from my writing. The one place it's killing me right now, though, is the book I'm working on for 2024. I made the gruesome mistake of reading a one fiction but based on a real story and one a nonfiction book in there because I need to read all this stuff to sort of get triangulate where I'm writing. Man, I'm glad I read the books because they're beautiful books, but I'm having a really hard time keeping them out of my book.
um
One of them
so
is written by Danny Elfman's mother, of all people.
what's her name?
Her name is Blossom Elfman.
That is news to me. Okay.
Yeah, it's wild, right?
uh well, since we've already kind of touched on families, let's kind of continue on there. So um your most recent book definitely is about families, I think, in a way that is different than the other works, whereas um you've had marriages with kids and you've had that dynamic, but from the point of view, this one is from the point of view of someone and their sibling, and of course their parents. I mean, a ghost story is of course crucial for the ghosts to be characters themselves. So I guess in writing it to you, what makes families feel real on the page for you?
Oh, well, first off, also, this is a family with two kids. Families are hard because families communicate entirely in backstory. I think anyone who's been dating someone and you go to a family dinner at their house for like one of the early times and you leave and you're like, oh, that was really nice. And your partner's like, oh my God, could you believe that mess in there? And like, it just all flew under your radar. You don't know that, you don't know what the backstory is on anything. And so to make a family on the page, I was like, I can only pull off a family of four. I can't do a family of six or a family of seven. I can't. Um, because, I have a 20 something thousand word document that's this family's history from the time the parents met to the year the book takes place. I goes into more depth in some years than others, but I need to know the trips they take and the jokes they have. And it's so much stuff that didn't make it onto the page, but I had to do that to make them feel real in my head. So yeah, that to me, families are all backstory, man. And the problem is backstory doesn't wind up on the page. And it's hard because you do a lot of writing and you want to use it and you can't, because if you use it, you're just going to bore your reader.
Um, just curious, how much did you have to cut out of your latest? Do you have any kind of
Oh, a
idea of like
lot.
count?
A lot. Yeah. The first draft of the book, the draft people are going to read is, I think, 110,000 words, 100, I think it's 118,000 words. The first draft was around 190,000 words. So 60 or 70,000 words, give or take. And also there are three radically different versions of this book. I mean, really different, that I wrote before I got to this fourth one, which brings up, and two of those versions where I thought, good versions. One of them I think is still pretty great, but it's just they weren't right. It wasn't landing.
So, a lot of times people who are interested in wanting to listen to interviews and see authors are people who want to be writers themselves. In your experience, do you find that disheartening to have to go back to rewrite these novels and draft after
Nah,
draft?
it's hard, but it's not disheartening. It's the job, right? Like I could be digging ditches or like working at McDonald's. Like I could have a job that actually like wrings me out. So it's the job, like I'm really excited. The book I'm writing right now, it's falling apart. Like I'm 60,000 words in, and it's fallen apart. But I know this is what happens. And it means I need to go back and redo backstories. I need to go back and rewrite earlier parts. I just switched the whole thing to present tense and first person. It was third person past tense before. Like it's how I know that I'm on the trail of something.
So is it a matter of you have what you think is the plot line of the story and then that just falls apart as you work?
That's part of it. And also, you realize you don't have enough gas in the tank. You realize that there's not enough emotions there. There's not enough backstory. You're not invested in the character enough. Um, my best friend's exorcism is one where I threw out that whole book and rewrote it from scratch. I made it a better book, but like it just didn't have enough gas in the tank. And I kept adding things. It's like your car doesn't have enough gas in the tank, and rather than take the time to pull over and pay the money and gas up and get back on the road, you like, you add a pair of truck nuts, and then you add like, some hydraulics, and then you add one of those like UFO lights underneath, and maybe a chaser light around the license plate. You're just adding crap. You're not fixing the problem, which is you don't have enough story in your gas tank to get you over the finish line.
Well, that leads nicely into something else I wanted to ask you about, which was, you know, in a lot of ways, I think what makes a good horror story work in terms of storytelling is it's all about how effectively you can hold back and then show something. Because that's usually we see it most often is like that's the jump scare, but I think that that's a simplification of really what a whole cumulative effect can be. So I guess what is your do you have any thoughts about that act of showing and then when to show and when not to show?
That's one of those things where you really have to rely on instinct to some extent. It's funny. A lot of I've really become a big fan of magic as I've started writing books, because a lot of the stuff magicians talk about is stuff that you do as well. You want people to think you're doing one thing when you're really doing another. You want to misdirect them by having them look at this over here until you're ready to pull out that over there. So misdirection. I mean, really, writing is just organizing the speed at which you deliver information to the reader. Like when you let them know information and when you don't, that's the gig. And so that become anything you can do to make that more interesting and take them by surprise is a useful trick to have.
Do you think in terms of set pieces at all? Like, do you have
Oh yeah,
early on like idea like, okay, this
yeah.
is what I want to happen at some point?
Yeah, and a lot of times I have to let those go. Because you know the problem is at the end of the day, what people want isn't a cool set piece. What they want is something they want characters they care about. We're monkeys. We like to see what other monkeys are doing. We like to watch them. And so you can have the most I've had amazing set pieces I've had to cut out of stuff that I thought were great, and they probably were great, but they just didn't work. People would rather you know, they'd rather have the emotional stakes be there. You know, the for all of Southern Book Club and its scenes of rat eating and bodily dismemberment and all the other disgusting things, the scene people come up to over and over and over again and mention is a scene of a husband betraying his wife. And you know, it's that if you can get people to buy in emotionally, that's the job. That's you've done you it's easy from that point.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think that that is the pathos that you have in your books. I think is genuinely actually one of the surprises I feel like people might not expect, and something that is full of quirky characters and humor is that there is um, genuine emotion, and that the characters are often dealing with very relatable issues. You know, be it grief, be it trauma, uh, or dealing with the unfairness of being a woman in a man's world, so to speak. Um,
Well, you know, it's funny. Someone pointed out to me, and they're right that so much of my stuff revolves around people just not believing someone and the frustration of not being believed. And that's a big thing to me. Like that's something I used to like lose it if someone didn't believe if someone thought I was lying when I wasn't lying, because I lie a lot. And now I make a living from it. But like I would really lose it if I was being honest with someone and they didn't believe me. And so that's really worked its way into everything I do.
um, so I guess one question I have too is in writing ghost stories, this isn't your first published ghost story. In fact, Horror Store is a ghost story itself. And the introduction to your latest book, you even bring that up. So just curious, do you have any thoughts or reflections on ghost stories from writing a book about a haunted, quote unquote, IKEA store to How to Sell a Haunted House, which is a much more grounded horror story in terms of its family issues and grief and
Yeah,
um,
well, part of it was just like becoming a more confident writer and knowing that I need to get, if I can get people to buy in emotionally, I don't have to have a whole IKEA full of like, you know, rotting ghosts and torture instruments. I can just have a house with some dolls. But the bigger jump for me was going from my first draft of Horror Store or my first idea of Horror Store to the second. Because I used to work at a parapsychological research place in New York. And so I saw a lot of real accounts of hauntings and a lot of like I dealt with a lot of people calling in and you know talking about like they had a haunted house, so they wanted to know more about haunted houses. I read a lot in our archive that were accounts of hauntings and encounters with apparitions. And so when I landed the gig to write Horror Store, I thought, oh, this is gonna be so great. I'll bring in all this real life ghost knowledge. That's gonna be my thing. And what I rapidly realized is real life ghost stories are really boring. They're like listening to someone tell you their dreams. It's I was in a room and I was all by myself and someone walked across it. I saw my grandmother. Someone said my name, but no one else was home. Now, for the person experiencing that, that's a big deal. That the emotional wallop of that is a break in reality. But dude, you're just telling me your dream. I am not. That's not exciting. And I actually had a whole proposal for Horror Store based on all this like reality of hauntings things and all this stuff. And my editor was like, "This is really some snoozy stuff you're giving me here. Can you please make this more interesting?" So to me, that was the big jump, is realizing that the gap between a real life report of what someone believes to be a haunting and a fictional haunting are worlds apart.
Um, in that sort of vein of, I guess, with those real accounts, they're obviously shorter than novels. So, and in fact, a lot of ghost stories that are most famous, fictional, I mean, are short stories. In fact, this past December, I did a event on that was we had an audiobook reader come and do a classic reading of a ghost story, bringing back that tradition of
Oh, nice.
Victorian ghosts. Yeah.
What was the
So
story?
it was Walter de la Mare's Seaton's Aunt.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah,
Oh, that's a
so
weird one to choose, man. That story's super like twisted.
I like to throw people curveballs, but
Yeah, no, it's a good
really
story,
enjoyed it.
but it's really emotionally dank and clammy, that one.
Well, he's one of those authors that I find his stories fascinating because they're like mysteries that you can't fully unlock, but there's usually a moment of some sort of emotional honesty, not always
Yeah.
pleasant honesty, that kind of feels like it unlocks the rest of the story. And I really admire that quality. Um, Hopefully the people in the audience did too. um, but so did you find much influence from those early 20th, 19th century ghost stories, like the M.R. James, the Charles Dickens, etc.? Were those things that you thought about when writing this?
Not really. More than anything, probably one thing that was really sticking with me was M.R. James's sort of fear of touch. So many of his stories involve touching something or being touched by something that's repellent, and so I really leaned into that. But that was as much as it got. I usually I just don't. It's hard for me if I start pulling in too much influence, especially from something that's written in the past. I start doing a bad pastiche of it. I actually wrote some stories called the White Street Society stories that are sort of my pastiche of like men's adventure fiction from the 19th century, or sort of those hardy adventure stories, or those and those occult detective stories that are always like very jolly hockey sticks and, oh, we've solved this haunted house. Good thing we brought the gun to shoot that mummy. But yeah, so I start doing a bad pastiche if I go there. But M.R. James's touch thing was definitely a part of this book.
It's funny because when I think of M.R. James, I actually that's the quality I think of because there's those really great BBC ghost stories for
Yeah,
Christmas that one of my favorite images is from their adaptation of the stalls at Barchester, and it's the Reverend at the top of the stairs and this demon hand coming down and putting on his
yeah,
shoulder and
yeah,
saying, "I want to wish you a happy new year." It's just genuinely creepy, but like
yeah.
yeah, but
For me,
yeah.
I gotta say, in that, I love when he puts his hand on the armrest of
Mhm.
the chair and it changes. It's so gross.
Oh yeah. Well, another one that I have still haven't seen in any of the adaptations they've done of it, casting the runes, which is most
The
famous with
hairy
Night of
mouth
the
under the
Living.
pillow.
Yes, that's such a weird image, but none of them ever do it.
No one does it because it's too much like a vagina.
Wow.
Like, it's a mouth of teeth covered in hair in his bed, and like he flees in horror. It's a great image and a shocking moment, but I think the reason no one does it is they're like, so let's see some production sketches for what the special effect. Oh my, no, we cannot put that on screen.
Yeah, it's some things are better left for the page as far as imagery works.
Yeah. Well, it's
um
definitely it's funny. I mean, there's stuff like when I did Horror Store, I was like, I don't want anyone to ever make a movie out of this. So I'm going to have a climax that involves a whole flooded store because no one's going to pay for that in terms of production, and a lot of rats because no one's going to be able to wrangle all those rats. Well, now they can do it all digitally. So I'm an idiot.
um I recently rewatched the Werner Herzog Nosferatu, which features a lot of rats, and apparently it was just very good luck that the place they decided to shoot in had a huge rat infestation problem. They had recently just corralled all the rats, and they were
Only on
like,
a Herzog film
yeah.
would a rat infestation of one of your locations be a stroke of good luck.
I mean, that's what we love them for.
Exactly.
um, I guess one last question in talking about the just in general the craft of writing horror in general is it is obviously, as we've kind of covered in this conversation, one with a lot of tradition to it, and it's always sort of a struggle. I think is not wanting to copy too much, or when do tropes become too hackneyed. And so how do you, someone who's like, obviously working within the tropes and the genre, like find ways to make that feel fresh to you?
Oh, it's all about going back to the core. You know, these tropes last because there's something in them that works. There's something in them that's sticky. I tried to write Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires before, and my editor turned it down because he's like, vampire books are just a little hackneyed. And so we did something else and came back to it later. But no, vampires aren't hackneyed. You just have to not do a hackneyed vampire book. I was just having this argument with someone about slasher movies, and they were being really, really dismissive of one of the franchises. And I was saying, think about it. This movie has gone through so many, like it's very, very great that we've got Citizen Kane and Moonlight and I don't know, invade. Well, I can't say Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but like La La Land or Nightcrawler. But those movies don't have a lot of sequels, and there's something in even this hackneyed franchise. This movie has had 13 versions of itself. It has survived overexposure. It has survived bad directors. It has survived people laughing at it. It keeps coming back again and again and again. And the reason it does is because there's an engine in there, and it may be buried under a lot of crap, but there is a solid gold engine somewhere in there that makes this something we keep coming back to. And you just have to get in there and be willing to scrape back all the junk and sort of cut away the stuff that feels essential but might just be habit and find what that engine is.
One last question, sort of off that. Have you read or seen any movies or something recently that you feel like um, achieves what you're saying, that freshness?
I mean, gosh, I haven't seen anything lately. Everything I've been on, the book I'm writing now is set in 1970, and I've been working on it almost all year. So almost everything I've seen has been old. But I saw Barbarian and liked it. But I don't feel like Barbarian takes an old trope and refreshes it. It does something different. So, oh yeah, you know what does? What We Do in the Shadows,
Oh
100%.
yeah.
I mean, that is such an Anne Rice vampire book or movie. That is it's aristocrat vampires. They're too good for you. They live among us. They're decadent. They wear all these posh outfits, and it finds something brand new to do with them.
Um, it's funny that you mentioned romance again, because one of the things I was also just thinking about while we were talking is um, I'm not someone who's particularly drawn to romances as a storyline. I really like stories about relationships. I think couples are fascinating for the fact that, you have two people who know all the weaknesses of that person
Yeah.
and do a lot with that. And in yours, I feel like I don't think I've seen a straight romance in any of your books as well. Is that something that you've ever thought about trying yourself?
Yeah, I need to. I I need to. I haven't, and I should. It's it's hard because I've been married for 30 years, and it's something that's really important to me, but it's also something that's it's anyone who's in a long relationship. It's not easy. And so picking that apart and putting it on the page seems really difficult to me. I'm not sure I'm there yet, but there is a werewolf marriage story that I really want to do. I haven't been able to get to it yet.
Yeah, I'll read that whenever you write it. Um, I want to go ahead and give people a chance who are watching this to, if they haven't read How to Sell a Haunted House, to go ahead and pause this and come back when
Take
you
a
do.
hike.
Yeah, because we're going into spoiler country. So without further ado, um, having read How to Sell a Haunted House, and I have to say, it's one of my favorites of yours so far because
Oh,
it
thanks.
feels well. It's one of those books that it felt like it was written to me in certain ways because uh, I love sinister puppets and I love the
Who
whole
doesn't?
aspect of that book. Like that was such a surprise to me and such a wonderfully because you go there with it. You don't just not just oh there's some dolls. It's no, it's full immersion into puppets and how creepy they can be and also just I don't know how like fascinatingly human they are. And I think that's a
Yeah.
good talk about in it. But I just want to ask right off the bat, um, where did Pupkin come from? Because man, what a good villain!
Oh, you mean uh this guy?
Yeah. Oh, look at him.
um, yeah, so basically he is well, two places. One is we all have those guys that we have as kids, those stuffed animals, the lammy, the blankie, whatever it is that's like that comfort object when you're a kid. And it's really hard to move on from there. I have a very hard time with the Toy Story movies because it's like it makes you feel very guilty. Like, where oh, my curious George? Well, I know what happened to him. But so so that was one. I mean, I knew that that relationship with inanimate objects and that childhood relationship with inanimate objects was something that would be fun to stick my finger in and poke around. But the other place he comes from is he's my wife's childhood stuffed animal named Snokio. Snokio, no one knows where Snokio came from. He kind of just appeared. He's not a puppet, he's a stuffed animal, but he is very much Pupkin in the non murdery way.
Did you? I'm curious. What kind of research did you go into as far as that's concerned? Because one of my favorite, I should have written it down, but one of my favorite sentences is when Mark is takes over the narration for a bit, and he talks about seeing these radical street artists perform a
Yeah,
puppet play. It says that the people who were watching it suddenly start getting the Eastern European puppet vibes and knew to
yeah,
stay away. And he's like, but
yeah.
I was drawn to it. And I was like, that's me. It's like, that's, I love Jean-Jacques Mager stuff and things
Oh
like
yeah.
that. Um, so did you do a lot of research on puppets?
Well, I did a lot of research on puppets, but also I was in a radical puppet collective for a while in university. I mean,
What's
that
y'all's
is
name?
very. Oh yeah, it's I don't want to tell you the real name of
Okay.
the group, but yeah, they were a splinter group from Bread and Puppet in Vermont, and so yeah, I was all about that stuff. I was living in Boston and doing puppetry, and a lot of those puppets are ones we built. So yeah, that stuff was right there, man. I didn't have to go far to get that.
Do you still stay honed on your
Indulge.
puppet skills? Yeah.
No, I don't, and I wish I did because really good puppet theater, we have such a weird relation. Inanimate objects like puppets, like they get past our defenses really fast. Like think about how fast someone goes from 0 to 60 when they stub their toe on like an ottoman. This is the wrong. Like, what the hell are you doing there? Like, get it. Like I mean, like my car's like, oh, you better not break down, or come on, baby, like, give me a little power here. Like we really go from 0 to 60 with the animal. They just slip past our defenses. And so puppet theater really, I've seen so many shows that if it was people doing it, it'd be like, ho hum. But with puppets, man, you can't take your eyes off of it.
Well, yeah, I know it's funny because I often, as someone who likes them, also encounter a lot of people who feel very unsettled by them. Like, I really like Bunraku, the Japanese
Yeah.
I think there's something just beautiful about the dolls and the dedication that goes into making them, because it's to performing them, because it's something like, it takes like three people to control them. You have to spend like 10 years just
Yeah,
working on hands, 10 years working on the feet, and then after 20 years of doing this, then you can be someone who can control the whole puppet. And that sort of
yeah.
dedication is just fascinating to me.
Well, it's, we were talking earlier about magicians. It's the same thing where the reason you're able to do something is because you spend a ridiculous amount of time learning to do something relatively useless, right? Like I am going to, learn how to hide a card inside my ear. And I'm just gonna do, or, I'm gonna learn how to move this little porcelain and cloth hand like it's alive. And I'm going to spend months learning how to do that the best way possible. A normal person doesn't do that. And with a book, it's the same thing. There is so much behind the scenes work. And then people are like, oh, I read it in 2 days. And I'm like, good. Like it should look
Yeah.
effortless. But the reason you like it is all the effort that goes into it, which is one reason, like you're saying, I really like puppetry because a lot of effort goes into it. But it looks
Yeah.
deceptively effortless.
And like, to me, that's what makes something like that superior to, say, CGI, which CGI takes a lot of skill. Like, it's not a matter of that. It's just it's that tactile feel
Yeah.
that puppets have. Yeah, I think that's what also upsets people. Like, I think they can see that there is this thing that looks not perfect, whereas
Yeah.
CGI is perfection, or the
Yeah.
approximation of it.
Yeah, and it's fun. It's funny, like you look at the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies and how well those hold up because so much of it's practical. I mean, there's a lot of CGI in there, but the CGI works really hand in hand with practical. And then you look at something like his Hobbit movies, and a lot of that was CGI generated without the practical, and it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't hold up the same way.
No, yeah, it's for sure. And I think that carries over into horror movies, is so much of the practical effects gives it so much more personality. Recently I saw the 4K version of The Thing in theaters,
Mhm.
and it was the first time the remake of The Thing. The first time I'd seen it in a long time, and man, just seeing those practical effects and that sort of just crisp
Yeah,
definition is just insane. How much you believe them, even though you can tell they're not real. I mean, if you someone who's seen a lot of movies, it's just still so unsettling what they're able to do. And so just,
yeah. Well,
I feel like
also
it's
yeah, go
please go
ahead.
ahead.
No, I was just gonna
No,
say,
I
and
just feel like it
also
looks better to see. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, also, one of the other things is with CGI, you have to make a decision about everything: how a liquid drips, how steam rises, how light hits fur, how, all this stuff is a decision you make. But with the thing, like when they're doing the autopsy of the guy of when they burned the dude earlier, that is a sculpture that they burned and created, and they filled it up with goop. And so all that stuff Wilford Brimley's doing, the way the goop is, that's random. That's just physics. You didn't have to build a physics engine. It is physics.
um was Speaking of randomness, was any of what you how this worked with the in terms of House of the Haunted House? Obviously there's an escalation with the puppetries and puppets and animals. With that, was that planned, or did you improvise a lot of sort of that, like, ooh, wouldn't this be good in the moment?
I mean, half and half. Like you have places you want to hit. You know what I mean? You have moments you want to build to. But as you go along the way, accidents come up, and also the book you're writing is not the book in your head. That's why writers put stuff down for 3 weeks and come back to it, because what you put on the page is not what you think you put on the page. And that's the hardest skill I've had to develop, and I still don't have it great. Is I too often see the book I think I'm writing rather than the book I am writing. And like, I'm writing a book right now, and I have a scene where people like search a house. Okay, just search a house. It's whatever. It's designed to get from one plot point to another plot point. Well, now I realize like this. I wrote that scene on Friday, and I realized yesterday it doesn't. The scene of them searching the house is ridiculous, and if I don't spend the time unpacking it, I'm shortchanging the reader of something they're going to want to see, and I'm going to miss out on a lot of stuff. And so my instinct to keep moving and to move along and to do all this, it's not right. I gotta write that scene that I, you know what I mean? It's the same thing happens a lot with emotional beats. It's like, oh right, we've got to sit in this emotion with the character because that's what the reader wants. They want to be here for a minute and really feel this in an unusual way that they hadn't thought about before we move on to the next cool set piece I want to write.
No, and I think I think it really works in this one because I don't want to say it's misdirection, although I guess technically it is that I completely forgot about Freddie. I mean, I remembered that that was there early on, but
Yeah,
it makes once you get there, it's like, oh, of course, this is a haunted house story. It's like that's
yeah.
the ghost.
That was a lot of calibration. That was hard to do. Because you don't want it to be totally out of the blue because then it's not fair, but you want to, just make people think it's part of the scenery. So yeah, that was hard.
um, and I think that really added an extra dimension to Pupkin as sort of like the physical manifestation of this. Is I really love in its climax we have the Pupkin doll, the sort of um, shoddily made one that has the paper mache face and it starts
Yeah.
melting in this moment where it's at its most vulnerable. I thought that was just a really nice beat that you
Oh,
captured
thanks.
there.
Well, and actually, that is sort of bringing things full circle. That's somewhere where working for the parapsychology research place it directly informed the book. Um, so one of the things that always stuck with me is in Boston in the 20s and 30s, there was a really famous medium named Marjorie. Mina Crandon was her real name. She went by Marjorie, like Madonna. And she was super famous, did a lot of sittings. The place where I worked did a lot of investigations of her. They sort of wound up feeling like there was a real split in the society between people feeling like she was doing fraud and people who were like, no, it's proof of the afterlife. And it led to a lot of bad blood that went on for a long time. But she had this spirit named Walter who would speak through her. She generated a lot of ectoplasm. There's a very famous incident where Scientific American magazine investigated her when Houdini was one of the investigators, and it all went pear shaped and just imploded all over their faces like a custard pie. Um, and Marjorie was this really famous, nationally known spiritualist, and her spirit Walter, people made casts of Walter's ectoplasmic hands and all this stuff. So, one thing that came out, and I don't think it was public knowledge, I could be wrong, but I don't think it was public knowledge until after Mina Crandon's death. When she was a little girl, she hero worshipped her older brother. And he was apparently this real golden boy, just one of those like charming rogues that he did the worst stuff, but you couldn't hate him because he was such a fun guy and so handsome and so likable. And he was a drunk. And his parents, when Nino, I think was 13 or 14, sent him out west to work on the railroad to toughen him up and be a man and, stop drinking and all this. And instead he got drunk and he was between two train cars that connected and severed and cut him in half and killed him. And his name was Walter.
Huh.
And so this woman spent her entire life pretending on some level, whether she believed it or not, to be her dead brother who she loved. And there's something, and that is a direct link between, there's a direct link between that and between Nancy Joyner and Freddie. That Freddie's ghost, it's her, it is, but it's him, it's her, but she has spent her life with this remnant of her brother who she loved as a kid. Um, and that she feels this guilt over, whether she knows it or not. Um, and so that's, and I feel like there's grief is a weird thing and it has its own timetable and it works itself out in its own way. And anyone who thinks you're in charge of that process is kidding themselves.
No, yeah, that's really interesting. You know, one thing I found really interesting about this one too is, as you were saying earlier, you revise a lot, you edit, you figure out the story you're telling, and then you figure out to hone that to this very polished product. Um, in that your previous books are usually always very it's usually one character it's focused on whose story we're hearing it through, and that's the lens we see the world. But and they're always unreliable to some degree. Any narrator is inescapably that if it's well written character. But in this one I feel like there's a really interesting thing here where the character the third person limited narrator protagonist thinks that they're telling the story, and you find out like that they're completely delusional or kidding themselves about really what the story is. And then you do what I think is, what to me what felt like the most sort of 19th or early 20th century ghost story thing was you had
Yeah,
someone tell a long ghost story in the middle of it, which was
I
interesting
know.
because no, I just want to
And
ask.
that's,
Yeah, please go
yeah.
ahead.
No, I was just going to say real quick, I'm glad you caught that because that is something, yeah, you're right. Beyond the M.R. James thing of touch, that is definitely something I took from old ghost stories because, yeah, they'll, they'll break. I mean, all of Turn of the Screw is someone telling a story. So yeah, I totally stole that. I'm really glad you saw that you mentioned that because I was not thinking that way. But yes, that 100% did.
And it's also interesting because it's a male narrator, and that's something we've talked about before in the past. Is you creatively feel more in tune with writing from female perspectives. How
Yeah.
was that for you writing the character of Mark? Because he's a character that is really, you feel like he's so despicable for the first half of the book, like, or just a complete loser, and then
Yeah.
you realize that no, there's more to him than this.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. He's there's Mark is fun to write because I love writing those guys, sort of big, loud, swaggering dudes. You know what I mean? Like I really like them a lot. And I had a really good friend who passed away many years ago. And it's funny to me because I'll mention him to people now and they'll say, "Oh my God, he was such an asshole." And I'm like, really? I mean, I get that like he had qualities that were of an asshole variety, but like you never saw this or this. And I realized that they just didn't know him well enough to see those other parts. And that's Mark, you just don't realize what his story is. And, you know, Louise thinks she has his number. She thinks she has everyone's number, and she's wrong, 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 wrong. And Mark, to some extent, thinks he has Louise's number, and he's kind of wrong too. Like they both think they know each other, and neither of them do.
No, yeah, it's really interesting in that I would say, as far as what is happening in terms of the plot, Mark sort of is more honest about it than she is. It takes her a long time to even admit to herself that, like, even when some of the weird things start happening, she's sort of is willing to not like really pay attention to it to some degree. Um,
Well, Mark's more honest, but he's also in denial. He won't even get on Facebook to look and see what happened to those people in the puppet company because he's scared. He's scared of having to take responsibility for it. He drinks too much because that's his way of dealing with things. It's self-medicating. So I agree with you. He is more upfront about what happened, but he's also in the thrall of more coping techniques to deal with it.
um, did was that something that you always wanted to do? Was have Mark have his own voice in the story, tell his own side of it?
Not at first, but I realized that there was no other way to do it. And then it got really long. It used to be much longer. I mean, I think there was a point where Mark's story was like 11,000 words long, which is way too long.
Well, I was wondering when I was reading it because it's the start of I think it's part four of it,
Yeah,
of the book, and I was like, oh, is all of part four going to be like Mark's story? But
yeah,
yeah, no, I mean, I think his section is, to me, has the most unsettling part, which is it when they're in the house and everybody just goes full pumpkin, and just sort of you get these
yeah.
sort of like almost like jump cuts of just chaos and very like what did we do?
Well, it's also one of those things where I've done a lot of those theater games and exercises and theater work and stuff, and it's intense. And especially with mask work, a lot of it is about erasing kind of your personality and letting this other personality of the mask kind of become the performer. And the reason that stuff is safe is because there's a person in the room who's a babysitter who is the person who polices the lines and says, okay, we're done with this. When you do some of these theater exercises, like even without masks, you've got someone there who can like let you get to the edge but not go over. If you don't have that person, that stuff can get brutal. And that stuff you saw in the 60s and in the 70s, with things like the Living Theater and places like that, where these games would eat away at people's psyches. And really, I think, as brilliant as some of the theater was they came up with, I think some of the stuff they did to people was really damaging. And at times, the line between a cult and a company was very thin.
Speaking of the occult aspect, we do get some flavors of that with the extended family. We have like Aunt
Mm,
Gail and Aunt Honey. Is that correct, Aunt
yeah,
Honey?
and honey, yeah, yeah.
Were those characters that you always intended to serve that function, or did they sort of just develop into that?
Gail Gail stepped right up and was like, "Oh, I'll do that." Like I was like, "Oh hell, like I need someone, and okay, it'll be Gail." And Honey, I knew I wanted to write that character. I didn't know quite how much she'd be doing throughout. So they really sort of like took over a little bit, and they were supposed to be smaller characters, and they wound up being.
Well, I guess they're necessary in terms of a haunted house story being about hidden family secrets. You need
Yeah,
people who know the secrets that
who
have
know
been
that
hiding us
exactly?
the whole time.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
uh, I think that you definitely are not, you don't shy away from horror content. I mean, your books deliver like that, and I think that that's
Oh,
to
thanks.
their credit. But and I think it's interesting, and you're all, but I guess I think you're not a nihilistic author. That's not how you approach horror.
Right.
And so I guess, did you always intend for this book to reach sort of the pathos that it did? Or, because I mean, I feel like it could have very easily gone a different direction.
Yeah, but I can't do that. Like I can't end a book on a bummer note. I feel like if I end on a bummer note, I just haven't I've ended the story too early. Like because at the end of the day, it's funny. Someone once said, uh they were talking about they said, um someone I knew whose child died, they said, um, the worst thing about your kid dying is it feels like the end of the world, but it's not. And, horrible, horrible things happen to people every single day. And they get up the next day and they make breakfast for their kids and they go and, make sure their dad's light bulbs have all been changed. And they do their thing. They go to work, they do their job. We all keep putting our foot down one after the other. And it's very rare that something happens. It's just like full stop, all over, I'm out. Um, and there's something hopeful about that. I took a terrible, terrible, pretentious, awful English literature class called Mirrors of Nothing when I was in university. And the one good thing that came out of that class, well, two good things, is I had to read Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman, which is a book I love. And I had to read a couple of Beckett's novels. And in one of them, and I cannot remember, I don't know if it's Malloy Dies or The Unnameable. I cannot remember. It might be neither of those. There's the great line where he's like, I can't go on. I must go on.
Mhm.
And that to me is just the human condition right there in two short sentences. So yeah, I feel like, it always we go on, bad stuff happens and we go on. And so if a book ends in some kind of nihilistic ending, to me that's like when as a kid I dreamed about nuclear war. because I was like, that means I won't have to do my math homework. Like I won't have to do that like presentation I'm dreading on Monday because we'll all be dead. It'll be the end of the world. There's a real adolescent delight in the end of the world because it's like disruptive and it means I don't have to go to work on Monday. But generally, we have to go to work on Monday.
Um, well, I want to thank you for taking the time and
Yeah.
talking with me. Yeah. I just want to give you a chance to let people who've been tuning in know about anything you'd like them to know that you're putting out, or anything you'd like them to see online, places they can follow you.
Yeah, so all my dumb stuff is at gradyhendrix.com. That's so it's you can find it all right there. And I just want to say, so by the time you see this, I'll have released a bunch of new episodes of the podcast I do, Super Scary Haunted Homeschool, which is this really over. I started it during the pandemic, and it's horror history. So the first 7, 8, 9 episodes are sort of a step-by-step history of vampires. And man, this thing took so much more work than I anticipated. I finally got a crew on who's helping me do the production on it, which has been great and a huge load off. So I've been moving ahead with new episodes. So there's episodes about dolls, puppets, haunted houses, but it's called Super Scary Haunted Homeschool. You can find it on Spotify or wherever you ingest your podcasts, or you can get it off my website, gradyhendrix.com. But some of the podcast episodes I've done have been some of the creative projects I've been the proudest of. There's one about World War I, and there's one about Mina Harker and Dracula that I don't think I've ever done anything that's been as satisfying as those episodes.
Did you find that because one of the things I would say you have about your performances or your live events is that you have a performance quality to it. Did you find
Yeah,
that this sort of fulfilled an aspect that you hadn't really been able to do?
absolutely. I mean, it really stemmed out of the fact that I released Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires during the pandemic. And so the show I was going to do wasn't. And so I basically expanded that and expanded it into the podcast and then just kept going because I'm an idiot.
Well, I don't think you are, and I'm glad that you're out there writing, because I still do feel like you write some of the freshest stuff in the genre right now. So
Oh, thank you.
keep reading, and you
Really
better keep
kind.
writing. Well, thank you, Grady.
Thanks, man. All right. I'll talk to you soon.